All right. So we're going to do a couple of things today. We're switching over to a different view of ethics and morality altogether, different from Aristotle's virtue ethics and rather different from Kantian ethics as well. So congratulations once again on completing your second assessment. And we're moving on to a view of morality by Sigmund Freud and also a gloss on Freud's ideas by Todd McGowan. So Freud is again a thinker who lived before our time. His years are for you on the screen right now. So he's 19th and 20th century. And Todd McGowan is presently at the University of Vermont, and you'll be looking at his piece. You've been reading it, The Superego or the Id. And these ideas about the superego, about the ego and the id, were developed by Sigmund Freud, who is also known as someone who established the school of psychoanalysis, although that we're not going to be talking about. We're going to be thinking about the structure of the soul or the psychological apparatus, as Freud called it. That's what we're going to be looking at and also attempting to understand what the structure of the psychological apparatus, as Freud presented it for us, what it means for our understanding, our ideas of a moral life. Okay, so again, the terminology for us is structure of the soul, psychic structure, psychological apparatus, or mental life. All of these are used interchangeably, okay, for our purposes. So, unlike with the previous strains of thought that we were taking up and then applying to practice in terms of ethics and morality, Freud tells us that we are not at all actually born moral. So our morality is not innate. That's on the slide for you now. Innate simply means from within nature, inborn. We are not born moral. In fact, as far as Sigmund Freud is concerned, we are born quite on the opposite, immoral, unruly, unwieldy, not to say, somewhat untamed by nature. We're not moral. That all comes as we mature, as we grow, as we go through the development and stages of coming into social life, into socialization. And so, as I mentioned, what we want to take a look at is Freud's understanding of the psychic apparatus, also on the screen for you now, or of mental life. He stratifies mental life for us, Freud that is. Stratifies simply means divides into segments, right? So stratification of mental life and the structure of the psychic apparatus, according to Freud, is as follows on the screen for you now. We have for Freud three main elements of our mental or psychological being. And they are as follows. I will be giving you a little bit of German since that's the language that Freud worked in. We have the superego, which in German is Über-Ich or Ich-Ideal. Ich in German simply means I. So superego or Über-Ich is something like the over-I, the supreme I, ideal me, ideal I, right? Über-Ich, Ich-Ideal. And in the superego, and that's now we're talking about the way that Freud saw the formation of our mental or psychological life. So we have the superego, the ego, and the id, not ID, but id. That's the proper way to talk about this. Superego is that part of ourselves, of our mind or soul, where the highest ideals are located, our moral values, our striving toward better life, toward the common good, our altruism, our superior goals, our most brilliant and purest aims, our ideal self. That's in the super ego. That's all I'm going to say about it. For now, I will be developing the super ego idea as we go on, and also as we start turning toward McGowan's piece. So that's one part of our psychic life or mental life. Then we have the ego, and the ego is the self, or in German, das Ich, so really me, the self, or I. That part of our mental life or of our soul, the ego, goes in between the superego and the id and serves to mediate, to stand in the middle or in between the superego with its superior aims and ideals, and the id, about which in just a moment. So it's the ego that you most readily identify with yourself, such as you are. And not only does the ego mediate between this higher element of your mental or psychological life and the id, but the ego also gives you a kind of reality check, right? So that which can and cannot be attained, that which is desirable and preferable as opposed to that which can in fact be accomplished. So, whereas the superego operates under the principle of the ideal self, world, and so on, the ego, the mediating element, the in between, operates under the principle of the real. And then we have the id. In German, it simply says das Es, the it, the that, id. Not ID, please. People keep calling it ID, but it's id. That's how you pronounce it. In the id, you have this huge reservoir, this pool, ocean really, of psychological and mental energy where your primitive and powerful instincts live. So it's in the id that your basic instincts reside. Instincts like love and hate, or more straightforwardly, like aggression and sexuality. Those really raw, powerful parts of your mental and psychological, instinctual is key here, instinctual self. That's in the id. And another critical thing to remember about the id is that it's in the unconscious. So, although your instinctual self is obviously part of you, you don't have waking life conscious access to those extremely raw, untamed, powerful drives. They exist within you, within your mind, within your soul, but what you come in touch with in conscious daily life is not that raw energy. It's something that's already been refracted or filtered through. So it has this exorbitant, extraordinary power of the instinctual drives, but you don't have direct conscious access to it. It's within the un or subconscious self, okay? So your unconscious memories are also there in the id. So this is then the structure of the mental or psychological life for Freud, the superego, the ideal, the id, the raw, powerful, instinctual, unconscious reservoir of energy within you. And then the ego, which goes in between the superego and the id and gives you a reality check, right? In the real. All right. Now, within the id, you have primarily, as Freud saw it, two types of drives. Within the id, you have primarily eros, and that's Freudian language. He took the term eros from ancient Greek, and it does mean love in ancient Greek, a certain kind of love. So in the id, you have eros and thanatos. So if eros is this instinct, again, you don't have access to it, right? It's in the unconscious. Eros is the drive toward unity, toward love. Then thanatos translates from ancient Greek as simply, it says death. Thanatos means death. So in the id, you have instincts operating under the pleasure principle, and that's your eros. And also, you have operating under the death drive or thanatos. You also have a set of drives or instincts. So, what do we have under eros on the left-hand side of your screen now? Operating under the pleasure principle, as the term kind of self-explanatorily says, self-preservation, sexuality, connection. So this longing and yearning, powerful yearning to connect with otherness, with the world, right? Eros is a unifying, binding kind of drive where you reach out toward otherness. And also, to some extent, Eros is operative in an attempt to come in touch with yourself. So, critically, it is the drive of sexuality, but not only, it's also the drive that brings you towards self-preservation, continuation of life, as in family, and so on. Okay, under Thanatos, what do we have? Under the death drive, you have the opposite of eros. You have aggression, violence, with this rageful anger, right? Remember, these are raw instinctual drives that you don't come in touch with in everyday life because they simply would be much too powerful, much too overwhelming, you know? They're there, these powerful energies are within you, but they are filtered or refracted in everyday life. And so Thanatos may sound like only kind of destructive or bad place, right, of drives, but that's actually not entirely true. Yeah, we do talk about aggression and violence when we think about Thanatos or the death drive, but it's also from within the reservoir of the energies under the death drive that you get this protective, defensive instinct, right? To defend against outside, against unwelcome, untoward pressure or influence, against something that's perceived as undesirable or as an enemy, to defend oneself against everything in the world so that you can draw a difference between here I am and here is everything else. That difference is partially there because of the drives operating under the death drive, because you can push everything outside and say, no, definitively everything else is not me. It's not that you do this aggressively. Again, as I said, in everyday life, you don't get access to these raw impulses from within the id. But if there were no energy at all from within the reservoir of the death drive, then it's questionable whether we would be able to draw a difference between the world and ourselves, because everything would have been one, right? Nothing would be pushing against everything else. You wouldn't be able to say that you are you and not whatever it is that is in the world out there. So hence this line under Thanatos on the right-hand side, that also the death drive helps us guard, so protect and build the sense of ourselves, our ego. Okay. So the death drive is not, that's on the bottom now, is not only a place of negativity, although primarily it is that, it is the power of the negative, but like an ant colony in the forest that kind of swoops around the forest and cleans it up, frees it of detritus, of things that have fallen, have died, have withered away, and need to be cleaned away. Like an ant colony in the forest, the death drive has this function of going through your mental life and your psychic apparatus and kind of cleaning up all of that ossified or kind of calcified stuff that is no longer desirable, no longer needed, but is there and needs to be gotten rid of so that you can move on, so that you can live on energetically, right? So death drive has that cleanup function as well. And so the accumulated baggage of the past gets digested and cleaned up by the death drive as well. So on its own, we can say that the death drive is largely destructive, right? That violence and aggression. But since it's not alone, it is always together with Eros. Together, they are reconstructive. They're not just destructive, they are rejuvenating, working together. They're reconstructive. Now for a moment back to Eros. So, yes, under Eros, under the pleasure principle, we have this instinctual drive, longing toward connection and unity with otherness, right? With the world outside. But it's not that we necessarily immediately satisfy these drives. It's not that we just, operate in reality, in conscious life, guided by the pleasure principle. That's not the case. Why? Because drive satisfaction, as Freud saw it, this instinctual, unconscious drives, the satisfaction of these drives is actually inhibited, which means that it's not immediately met with a satisfying object. Rather, there's something that gets in between. That's what I mean when I say refraction or filtering. So you don't get to satisfy your powerful drives right away. That's not how human society works. Instead, what happens is that you, and here's another term, you sublimate. Yeah. You don't get immediate satisfaction of, say, a sexual drive or aggressive drive. You don't lash out angrily at others immediately. No, in conscious life, that's not how it usually works, especially in public situations, right? There is a stopper, there's a filter, there's something in between the drive and the expression or satisfaction of that drive. And that something is sublimation. So when the drive doesn't get immediately expressed or satisfied, but gets sublimated, basically gets taken up and redirected into something else. There we get on the left-hand side now in the parentheses after sublimation, the drives go into higher goals, into excellent pursuits, into friendships, into art, into career expectations, right? And goals and so on. So you don't immediately satisfy a drive, you forego immediate drive satisfaction. And because of that postponing of immediate satisfaction, the drive gets redirected into something else, okay? And those are not necessarily bad things. Often they're excellent things, right? Like friendships or art or higher goals and so on. All right, so once again, the drives under the id are unconscious. This is your powerful ocean of psychic energy that doesn't necessarily get immediately expressed as eros or thanatos. Rather, they are operative in such a way as to create for us a certain network or mesh of social engagements and personal aspirations, higher goals, and so on. Okay. So sublimation also goes into the formation or coming into the world of the ego or of the self, of the conscious mind. Effectively, the human ego for Freud, yourself, right? The way that you see yourself, and you can say that you're different from everything else. So the human self is shaped or formed through the back and forth or push and pull of pleasure and pain. So to some extent, you can start relating it to the eros and the thanatos drives in the id. Through the differentiation of these energies, pleasurable and painful, and the postponement, right, or the lack of immediate satisfaction of the unconscious drives, by and by, your real, your conscious ego or self gets formed. There is like an accretion, I'll give you an image, like an accretion or a creation of a shell. By and by, from a small amount of sand, a mollusk creates around itself a shell that grows bigger and bigger with time. So that's to some extent an image for Freudian idea of ego creation, that there is a push and pull between the pleasurable and the painful. Initially, as far as Freud is concerned, he actually borrowed this idea from another thinker, from a female thinker with whom he was connected at the time in terms of social and kind of ideational, so connections of ideas, right? So it's not immediately Freud's idea, but anyway, the human self comes to be as an accretion of this differentiation of from a differentiation of energies from the pleasure and the pain. So where do these even come from? So we have to start thinking way back into babyhood, if you wish. And there's initially no sense of self for a baby. Initially, everything is just one. But if everything is one, then pretty much, it's hard to say that there is anything at all, because if there is no difference between, if there's no difference, then how do you even begin to identify what something is, right? The identification of something comes from it being different from something else. But this is not how, for a baby, as far as Freud is concerned, and again, I've said that he borrowed this idea from a female thinker, for a baby, everything is just unity, oneness, initially with the mother. So there's this just kind of absolute unity. And by, through the pain of hunger and the pleasure of being satiated or receiving food, there's this push and pull of energies or of sensation of pleasure and pain. And through this back and forth, right? Hunger, pain, food, satisfaction, pleasure, through this back and forth begins this process of differentiation of states, just the feeling of this is pain, not identified as such, but just discomfort, pain, and then no more pain, substitution with pleasure, right? So from this difference of energies, pleasure and pain, comes initial separation from the unity, from the oneness. with the mother the child at first experiences, a baby really at first experiences. And then by and by, there's this distance is greater and greater. And so the ego begins to come into being, and the baby and then a child begins to differentiate, make a difference between something that is not it and itself. So little by little, this comes into play. Recall that one lecture that we had on the importance of realizing that we can say, I am I, right? So I am myself, I am me. We can say that because we are also at the same time are capable of saying, I am not I, which means I am not other objects, other people, other world. I am not all that stuff outside. Not I is that stuff outside. I am not that stuff outside. I am not I. Therefore, I am me. I am I. So this is very pertinent to Freudian presentation of the way in which ego forms from the initial unity and oneness, how it by and by this separation, this distance between the baby and everything else starts to open up. And remember when I was giving you the account of the way in which we can say that we're different from the world, and at the same time, we're already presupposing that there's a world out there that is not yet available to artificial intelligence technologies, right? So I was saying at the time that this kind of lightning flash realization that I am I comes at the same time. It has to come at the same time as the realization that there is a world out there that is not me is happening. You can't have one without the other. You cannot say, I am me, I am myself, I am I, if at the same time you're not realizing also that there is the world out there and it's radically different from you. So those two have to come together. And as far as Freud is concerned, they do. As the distance between everything else and the baby and the child develops, so at the same time, the sense of self begins to accrete to the ego, forming ego of a child. Very important to keep that in mind, that these moments are together. Realization that there is a world out there that is not you, and the formation of you as the self, as the ego. They come together. Okay. Now that was a synopsis, right? So a shortened version of the presentation of Freudian ideas. Now we need to look at what Todd McGowan gives us as his interpretation of these notions from Freud. And so you had a few reading questions. One of them was, what's the traditional view of the relationship between ethics or morality and the superego, right? So McGowan tells us that initially or traditionally, and I already started there, right? It's the superego that is the place of our moral values, of higher aims and pursuits, of ideal goals or ideals, of higher standards that need to be reached. So it's in the superego that morality is located primarily, approximately, and for the most part. And just to make this clear, so far as the id, as I said, is in the unconscious right? So you don't come in touch with the raw, powerful drives. They are in the unconscious life of you. The superego kind of takes up all three elements: the unconscious, the pre-conscious, and the conscious life as well. So the superego reaches into the unconscious, and McGowan is going to make a lot out of it, that the superego has this unconscious constitutional element to it. But the ego is also in the conscious world, right? Because when we're engaging with moral postulates, moral values. We're doing it consciously, and it's in the superego that the ideals and the moral values live. Superego, the way that it forms, that's another important element that I want you to keep in mind. Another important element, in addition to remembering that traditionally it's in the superego that morality lives, right? So another point to keep in mind is that you're not born with a superego. It forms, it shapes by and by. And first, very interestingly, superego begins to shape up from outside authority. So when your parents are telling you what to do and what not to do, what is dangerous and what's good for you, when to stop, acting a certain way and adopt a different attitude and so on. So these parental instructions or oversight and care, of course, and also the social norms. So from outside, from the parents, from society, that command, you shall do this and not that, right? Because something is better than something else and something is entirely a bad idea. That imposition of limits, really limitations on also partially on your instinctual life, on that life of the id, that imposition of law and limit, that comes from the outside, from parents, from society. These commandments of what one should and should not do. But then, and it's really quite fascinating, this outside authority, external means outside, the outside external authority gets internalized. It becomes your inner voice. So in other words, I guess when you're told enough times to stop doing a certain thing because it's dangerous or painful or just plain wrong, by and by, you internalize this no, right? In this limit, this no saying. It becomes a kind of internal stopping point, really. So that I find to be absolutely fascinating, that the superego, which becomes the place of morality and the voice of internal authority, yeah, so authoritative, don't do this, you tell yourself because you know it's wrong, right? You're not born with that. That's where we started this lecture. For Freud, you're not born with that internal voice of no saying, of this is lawful and this is not, this is moral and this is not. You by and by accrete it, learn it, accept it as your own, but from outside, from society and from your parents. So external voice of authority gets internalized. You take it on the inside, and thereby your superego begins to form. And what Freud is very interesting in describing in his later work, really quite late, Civilization and its Discontents, is this idea that the superego, once it's formed, right, once the voice of external parental or social authority gets internalized and becomes your kind of internal limit setter, yeah, once that happens and you develop a superego, and by the way, people's superegos can be stronger or weaker, yeah. Some of us have a greater hold on ourselves, some lesser, and it's hard to tell which one's better, by the way, depending on the situation. But anyway, Once the superego is formed, Freud sees it as setting up the superego within you, within your mind, sets up a kind of surveillance. It's like you have an internal sensor who sees everything that you are and therefore everything that you wish or may suppose to do, even before you do it. It's a very powerful authority, right? Because your parents know you, social norms and laws are powerful, but no one has that internal sense of what you are about to do or even what you're about to think or want. Nobody has that sense besides your superego. And so within you, within every single one of us, according to Freud, insofar as we're functioning social beings, there is this internal super thing, a voice of internal authority, internal inside surveillance, which tells you, don't you dare desire such and such. This is, reprehensible. It's bad. It's punishable. And so it's from the superego because it pre-guesses what we are about to want. And if we want something that's deemed or considered to be bad, then the superego pre-guessing that is punishing us even before we do it. And that pre-guessing and punishing oneself even before you're about to do something, punishing oneself for a thought, for a desire, that's a sense of guilt. So that comes from the superego, from the external authority being internalized and becoming this super powerful inside internal sensor, kind of lording it over you, So how can there's a question on the screen, how can a person penalize herself for bad or wrong thoughts? Well, through a sense of guilt, feeling guilty without even having done a wrong thing. Where are the harmful and dangerous impulses located? That's, I think, a fairly easy question. That's definitely in the id. And then McGowan. All right, so we tend to attribute our reprehensible or which means bad or punishable actions to biological drives. That's effectively where he starts out his article. And he says that traditionally the superego is the place of moral ideals. And we say that if there's something that we do or want or think that's immoral or reprehensible, which is, undesirable or bad, punishable, then it must be our physical constitution. It's our biology. So McGowan wants to actually move away from that idea. He wants to say that we're more complicated than just the split between ideal and moral and biological. He thinks that we are rather more complex beings than the simple divide. And so it's McGowan who develops for us this notion, rather he doesn't depart from Freud, but it's not a traditional interpretation. So what McGowan develops is he tells us that because the superego runs all the way into the unconscious, it reaches into the id where the drives are hanging out, right? These powerful drives of Eros and Thanatos. And the superego puts a blocker, right? Restricts these drives. But at the same time, the superego allows us to enjoy them without expressing them. Yeah, because the superego is the voice, internalized voice of authority, outside authority. The superego kind of has a very powerful grasp of what it is that we would rather, right, would want to experience, express, and so on. And so having this sense of our drives, destructive, instinctual impulses, right? The superego instead of letting us express them, puts a block or a stopper on these drives. And what we enjoy then is not the satisfaction of a drive under Eros or a Thanatos, but we enjoy the fact that we can restrict ourselves. We're lorded over ourselves instead of doing a wrong thing or perhaps even planning a wrong thing. We say, no, that's immoral, or that's illegal. And we're going to say, no, I'm not going to do this. And this voice of no comes from the superego. And at the same time, as you're telling yourself, no, I'm not going to do this, you then can, according to McGowan, you feel good about it. You feel good that you didn't do the wrong thing. You're being a moral person, but the catch for McGowan is that you're enjoying nonetheless this restriction of a very powerful drive, which, if it were to be expressed, would have been utterly immoral. And so McGowan, all that he really wants us to realize is that the root, kind of the deeply running root of our morality, of our moral laws and ideals, is grounded in this reservoir of utterly wild, powerful, and completely immoral drives. And what our morality amounts to, and perhaps this is much too simplistic, but that's what McGowan gave us. What our morality amounts to is a kind of patting yourself on the back when you don't let your instinctual, impulsive drives get satisfied. And so that's to some extent insufficient